The Holston River Valley was one of the first regions of the central southern Appalachians explored and settled in the late 18th century by the so-called over-mountain men of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. In clearing the land and establishing communities, these early settlers blazed the trail for subsequent migrations. They and their families left few documents that describe their lives, labors, and pastimes. Even so, we know quite a bit about the white settlement of southwest Virginia and eastern Tennessee due to the survival of their homes, farms, and tools. Further information has been passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition. By the study of old buildings and artifacts and their accompanying folklore, we have learned much about our past. One result of the recent growing interest in our local and regional heritage has been a boom in what is referred to as historic preservation, a field devoted to restoring and preserving sites and buildings of historical significance.
The field of historic preservation is one that is relatively new to this country, though it has a much longer period of development in Europe. In this country, we've been concerned really with the notion of what might be called applied history. And we've taken many of the more traditional kinds of history, which have included documentary history, published books. We've added to this the notion of trying to preserve the built environment, and that really is what historic preservation is all about. This requires, of course, that we look not only at buildings, but at engineering structures, at historic sites, archaeological sites of various types, that we research it using traditional methods of history, documentation, archaeological research, architectural research, the whole gamut of research techniques.
You can learn about a building's past from the study of deeds, history books, and photographs if they have survived. But more often than not, you learn of a building's past through word of mouth, especially if it is a dwelling which has remained in the possession of your family for some time. In this manner, its past unfolds as history mixed with folklore.
The Devault Tavern is a two-story brick house on the old Stagecoach Road, which is located in Leesburg, Tennessee, about 5 miles southwest of Jonesboro, Tennessee. It was completed in 1820. It took several years for the slaves to build the house, and they constructed the brick on the property. Much of the architecture came from Europe and from Pennsylvania architecture, and there are several different styles of architecture in the house. The bricks are arranged on one side of the house in the Spanish architectural tradition, and I think the European or French influences on another side of the house. It was used as a tavern for around 50 years. I'm not sure, there's no way of being sure exactly how long it operated and when it first began as an inn, but it was used during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and he at first was a senator to Tennessee, and there are many stories that circulate about his visiting the tavern while he was a senator, and then later even as a president. Andrew Johnson also visited the tavern, and James K. Polk spoke there once, and Henry Clay was his opponent then, and they both visited the tavern. During the Civil War, another tavern owned by the Devault family operated the tavern, and the Devault Tavern was just a private home. For the last 50 years, certainly, it has been just a private home. The Devault family have always been proud of the house, and they have kept as much of the house as they can unchanged. That includes the outbuildings, They tried to keep the slave cabins intact for years. There were about 5 slave cabins intact, but they finally deteriorated and had to be torn down. There still are some other outbuildings, the smokehouse, the corn crib, and the inn. And there are a lot of stories about the inn. Many of the Confederate soldiers and Yankee soldiers stopped at the inn and used the house too during the Civil War. In most cases, the Devault family's been careful not to change anything. There's a door, for example, on which a slave painted some good luck signs, and for years they wouldn't even wash the door. Finally, it had to be washed, and they very carefully painted over the signs so the signs would never be lost. But they refused to paint over any of the original wood if they can. E.G. Devault bought the tavern from other members of the family in around 1950. His wife then inherited the tavern. She spent a great deal of time and money trying to restore it. She did have to change some things, and certain things did have to be painted over. She also enclosed part of the house, which originally was a dog trot, which is typical of antebellum architecture. The front door would open into a hallway, and the house was built on both sides, and then the back door would open into the yard. And originally, I guess, the horses were tied right at the back door. She enclosed this into a back porch, and of course, a bathroom was added. And about 70 years ago, the old kitchen was changed to the new kitchen, and another kitchen was added because the old kitchen was quite large and was used for things other than just cooking. I've spent many summers at the Devault Tavern. Many of my relatives are Devault. In fact, my mother now owns it. And so over the years I've heard all of the stories especially about the ghosts and about the presidents. Some of these stories, especially the historical stories, might be able to be documented, but I think the most fascinating things about it are the stories of the family and how the house operated as a tavern and the different types of people who visited there.
Out of respect for the past, the Devault family sought to maintain those features of the inn intimately connected with its history. For example, the attic rafters remain as they were when soldiers hid there during the Civil War to avoid capture, and the corn crib, where Andrew Jackson was said to have spent a sobering night, also remains much as it did in the early 19th century.
The Devaults were always proud of the home. It's always been a beautiful home, even though it's old, and so they wanted to take care of it. They were always aware of history and historical things, and so even before it became popular not to change things in an old home, the Devaults, maybe out of stubbornness, maybe also just out of a natural sense of appreciation for older things, never would touch something, especially things that had an interesting story about them. Often then simply for sentimental reasons, things were not changed in the home. It was very difficult many times to try to live in a house like this and without making it more convenient, but I think they were willing to make the sacrifice.
Unlike the Devault Tavern, which has since its construction remained in the possession of a single family, many historical buildings are acquired by people with a deep interest in history and architecture, but with no prior knowledge of their past. For these people, different types of detective work are required to unearth the structure's past. The Derry Inn in Blountville, Tennessee is a case in point.
Well, the people from whom we bought this place, Mr. Ed Pearson and his brother, lived here and ran a little restaurant, and occasionally I think they took in roomers maybe. I'm not familiar enough with that. But as he got older, as Mr. Ed got older, he realized he couldn't maintain the place, and his brother was not well, and so they struggled. But I brought my husband down here on court business one day, and he was longer than I thought he should be, and so I came into the restaurant and asked for a drink, Coca-Cola or some sort of drink. And I looked around and I saw these beautiful hand-hewn beams exposed, lovely hand-planed woodwork, wide planks. And I said to Mr. Pearson, "Mr. Ed, this has been a magnificent pile in its day, hasn't it?" He said, "Yes, Mom, but it's seen better days." He says, "I just can't maintain it. And if I could find somebody that was fool enough to buy it, I'd unload on them." Well, I couldn't think of anything else after I saw the mantel in the gathering room, and he brought me in with an old lamp because there was no water, no light, no heat. It was just in its raw stage. He brought me into the gathering room and held the lamp up for me to see this beautiful mantel and all of its glorious woodwork. And from that moment, this building was mine.
Having purchased the inn, Joseph and Virginia Caldwell sought to restore the building to a state approximating the original. They began by reading Goodspeed's History of East Tennessee and other recognized authoritative works on the history of the area. They also carefully examined the structure itself.
Now, as I said before, this is a log house. It stood separate and apart from the store building. The store building is an older building. It has, it is post and, beam, with mortise and tenon construction, quite old. This is the log house, as I said. The door that goes into the dining room was a window originally, so that would indicate that the buildings were separate. But when Mr. Derry bought them, he incorporated them. And then, too, there's a beautiful three-story rock building in the rear. Now, there are those who think that that was the first building. Not so, to my notion. William Derry was an Irishman. The Irish people are extremely adept at building with rock. I was in Ireland last fall, and I saw beautiful rock work, and reminiscent of just the kind that is here in the back. So I feel sure that William Derry had this done, the rock part, after the turn of the century. However, it's a magnificent pile, and you get the whole thing together, it's astounding. There are 18 rooms, 2 attics, 3 cellars. Where on earth would you find in the wilderness country, and this was wilderness, this was Indian country. Some of the blinds would indicate you lock and bar the doors, you lock and bar the blinds, and you lock them from the inside with great, enormous iron bars that go across on the outside and they hook from the inside. This was for better protection against Indians and other marauders because this was raw country. I think Mr. Derry put the weatherboarding on. I believe that this was an exposed log building, and that he, when he bought and incorporated the whole bit, that he put the wainscoting or weatherboarding on.
As with so many who enter the field of historic preservation, the Caldwells found the work exhausting but most satisfying.
I do believe that there is no satisfaction gained that is so rewarding as the preservation and the restoration of early buildings and landmarks, especially great houses. Too much has been done with the bulldozer to my liking. I love the old buildings. I love the architecture of our early times, even from the log houses clear up through to the Victorian era. And I have enjoyed it. I do not set myself as an authority, but I mixed all of my furnishings and all of my the different styles of architecture and furnishings, and it's a conglomerate, but it gives a pleasant picture.
Not all historic buildings end up as restored private homes. Many become business establishments, community centers, or museums. Each of these preservation projects, in turn, serves the community by beautifying the environment, preserving urban centers and historic sites, and contributing to the educational and cultural enrichment of the community. Rocky Mount, located near Bluff City, Tennessee, exemplifies the application of applied history in a public setting.
In 1769, the same year that William Bean, who was considered Tennessee's first permanent settler in Tennessee, moved to Tennessee, the William Cobb family also moved to Tennessee and began to settle on the Watauga River. They built first a small little one-room log house, and the next year they began work on what became Rocky Mount, which is a very large two-story, nine-room log house. It was going to be their permanent home. The Cobb family was a fairly small family, but as it was situated on what became a major travel route through the settlement, they began to have a lot of visitors stop by, and they were very congenial people, apparently. They sometimes, as we're told, that people would stop by for tea, or sometimes they would stop by for a meal, or even overnight. So they had a lot of guests living on the major transportation route at that time. Rocky Mount continued in the family throughout its history until it was purchased by the state of Tennessee in 1959. It was simply handed down through the family. In 1959, John Massengill, who was the owner of Rocky Mount at that time, was renting the building, but he thought it was very important that Rocky Mount be preserved, mainly because of its part in the history of the state as the capital of the Southwest Territory. As you're probably aware, the Southwest Territory was from 1790 to 1796 when Tennessee became a state. And in 1790, William Blount moved to Tennessee and lived with William Cobb in Rocky Mount for 2 years while Blount Mansion was being built in Knoxville. And this is a major part of Rocky Mount's history that needs preserving. A lot of members of the family thought this was important enough to work on, put their effort into. So John Massengill sold the property to the state of Tennessee in 1959, and his cousin, Pauline Massengill de Vries, gave her time and a great deal of her money to restore the building. In 1959, when the restoration began, Rocky Mount was covered in clapboarding, and of course the clapboarding was taken off and the logs were restored. There were some outbuildings there. There was a smokehouse and a few other small crib-type log buildings in the area, but none of them were salvageable, so they were taken down and reconstructed. A kitchen was reconstructed on foundations that were there earlier, and a smokehouse. The Cobbs owned about 7 to 9 slaves, so we have also reconstructed one slave cabin and have plans for another one to be reconstructed on the site. The museum, the brick fireproof museum that is now also at Rocky Mount, was also built in 1960 along the colonial style.
The restoration efforts at Rocky Mount, as well as the exhibits and educational programs sponsored by the museum, require extra research and preparation.
To do this research, we're using primarily our library, which includes approximately 1,000 books, secondary sources and primary sources on mainly history and the technology of the time of the 18th century. We have also used some of the archives at East Tennessee State University. including some deeds from the Washington County Courthouse. Unfortunately, we can't use the deeds from the Sullivan County Courthouse because they've been destroyed. But this gives us an idea of what people owned and what the furnishings at the time were like. All of this is to try to illustrate to not just people, tourists that are coming through the area, what East Tennessee is like, but also to educate the people in the immediate area as to what their heritage is and what life has been like and how the community got to the point that it is right now.
Historic preservation and the research that goes along with it require patience, interest, devotion, and hard work. But the would-be applied historian is not without avenues of assistance.
I think I should mention to you that probably the main tool of historic preservation is the National Register in this country. In Europe they have similar types of registers, but in this country we use it actually primarily as a planning tool, but it is also simply a documentation of the past. The National Register was created in the 1930s, and it really didn't receive the impetus that it has now until the Preservation Act of 1966. And it is an attempt to record all of the significant historic properties in the entire country. This would include both things on a national level and local and state levels as well. The documentation for the National Register usually requires a person to first off analyze the building architecturally, write up a statement of some kind describing it, pursue the appropriate documentary research in which you uncover the building dates, how the building evolved. To some extent, of course, the architectural research is involved in that. Research in deed records, wills, other sorts of legal records are also an essential part. Once the building is placed on the National Register, then it becomes eligible for federal grants of various sorts. And in general, it is simply a recognition of the value of the property.
The U.S. government's Federal Register regularly lists buildings on a state-by-state basis as they are entered in the National Register. In addition, the Historical American Building Survey lists structures of particular national importance, and the Historical American Engineering Survey lists bridges, tunnels, and other engineering achievements preserved from America's past. The National Trust for Historic Preservation serves as the major umbrella organization for those active in the preservation of historic sites or structures. Their monthly newsletter and bi-monthly magazine provide helpful advice for those pursuing restoration projects. The National Trust also alerts its members to government policies that may affect their efforts. Whole communities as well as individuals can involve themselves in the preservation process. In Jonesboro, Tennessee, for example, the establishments of a civic trust promoted a community-wide movement towards restoring and preserving the historic structures of this first urban center west of the Alleghenies.
As part of the overall national move toward preservation that occurred in the 1960s, a lot of local citizens in Jonesboro became very interested in their own heritage. And so very late in that decade of the 60s, in about 1968, they began considering what would be the advantage of placing Jonesboro on the National Register as a historic district. And by 1970, they had actually succeeded in establishing a National Register district plus a local historic district which was created for purposes of maintaining the district and maintaining the facades of buildings, making sure the correct paint schemes were used, and that sort of thing. The Jonesboro Civic Trust itself has operated primarily in an educational role, in that we have tried to encourage people to appreciate their history, of which these buildings are the visible remains, and also beyond simply appreciating it, to give them some kind of technical expertise so that they can go about maintaining the buildings, preserving them, restoring them. We've also created some educational programs in an attempt to make a fuller recognition of the value of the town as Tennessee's oldest town and its role in the early part of North Carolina history. The Jonesboro Civic Trust, along with a number of private individuals and the state government and the federal government, have undertaken a number of projects. A lot of buildings have become really serious preservation projects in town. Probably the project that leaps to mind first would be the street work that was done in the early 1970s, in which we restored the original treatment of the streets, which was brick sidewalks with limestone curbing, an imitation old-time lamp, which is still on the street today. Of course, we couldn't reproduce the dirt streets. That's impractical for modern traffic. Then we proceeded on. This was a very successful project, I might add, and I think just about everyone in town has remarked to the great value it has to the town, not only for tourism, but just as a pleasant place to live day to day. A number of buildings in town have also been subject to restoration efforts. The Chester Inn is probably the most obvious one. It is one of our very few 18th century buildings built in 1797. It originally served as an inn and a restaurant on the old stage route, which passed right through Jonesboro. It has undergone a considerable evolution. The porch, which is on there now, is a very grand Victorian porch built by George Sprinkle in the Victorian period. In recent times, the Chester Inn has ceased to be an inn and has really become an apartment complex. Mostly there are old people living there at discounted rates, and we anticipate in the future that it may become an inn again, thus returning to its original use. The Christopher Taylor Cabin is another important building that's in Jonesboro. It originally stood outside of Jonesboro, and its significance relates to the fact that Andrew Jackson lived in it at one time when he was working in Jonesboro as a lawyer. And the cabin was moved in as a civic trust and town joint project in the early 1970s, was restored for use as a historic house museum, but is presently used as an information center. Other fine buildings architecturally in the town would be the Greek Revival churches, and I think these are particularly interesting in that the congregations of the churches have taken great pains to maintain the buildings in an accurate state. And the Presbyterian Church, which is here, is one of the most beautiful Greek Revival buildings that you could find anywhere in the entire country. A more interesting example of adaptive restoration, which is sort of a buzzword now in preservation, is the Academy Hill complex. This is Dr. Bill Kennedy, one of our big promoters of preservation here in Jonesboro, has taken an old school and is recycling it for use as a 13-unit condominium. The project is now nearing the end of its development period, and I think it's just one more example of Jonesboro using its old buildings for modern life.
Historic preservation serves to enrich our appreciation of our historical heritage, while at the same time demonstrating to us that we can restore new life and use to the dwellings of our forebears.
The purpose of preserving the built environment is really, it's many purposes. There isn't one purpose. Some people do it simply because they like the past, they love the past, it's interesting to them. Other people feel that we owe it to future generations simply to record how people lived at earlier times and to give them some sort of guidance in the future.